Yeah, my name's Gary Prevost. I was a professor here at St. John's, St. Ben's, from 1977 to 2017, teaching in the political science department. I came here after completing my master's and PhD at the University of Minnesota. Before that, I was an undergraduate at Union College in New York, much closer to where I grew up in a small town in upstate New York called Glens Falls. I can't actually remember exactly when I first had the war in Vietnam come into focus, because you have to understand, say, I'm a sophomore in '63, junior in '64, senior in '65, the war was very low key at the beginning. As far as an attitude about it, I was more learning about it. I was now beginning knowledgeable that this was happening. But like most people, the starting point was very much that this was a just war. President of the time, Lyndon Johnson, took a strong civil rights stand as a Southerner, which to me was very impressive. And I was deeply moved by a speech he gave in the first week of April of '65, in which he announced that he, in addition to having pushed through the Civil Rights Act the previous year, was now going to put the Voting Rights Act to Congress that summer, and it would pass. And I was deeply moved by the speech, deeply supportive of it. In the same week, he also gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University in which he laid out the rationale for sending the combat troops to Vietnam.
The United States is therefore prepared, as the President determines, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed forces, to assist any member or protocol state of the Southeast Asia Collective Treaty requesting assistance in defense of freedom.
And I was motivated right after that speech to go and write an editorial. I was editor of my high school newspaper, and I wrote a brief editorial in support of this effort in Vietnam. And I went off to college at Union, 50 miles away, that fall, 1965. But many of my high school classmates had volunteered for service in Vietnam, knowing they would go there, and seeing this as, for them, a continuation of the fight that their fathers had engaged in the Second World War. My dad said, no, you're going to college. You know, that's always been the plan. You're only the second in the family to go to college. You're going to be going to college, and you know, whether there's military service, that will come at another time, because at that point, deferments for undergraduate college were automatic. And a couple of my friends at Union that year had said, you need to read better on this. You don't fully understand the background. And they suggested 3 or 4 books. And in the summer of 1966, while I was working the job at the local power company that I had, manual construction kind of work, in the breaks and in some of the evenings, I read books on Vietnamese history. And I read a book by an advisor to President Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger, called A Bitter Heritage. And all of these scholarly works introduced me to a deeper understanding of how the United States had gotten into Vietnam. And the more that I read, by the end of that summer, it was very clear to me that this was going to be potentially a, not just a military problem. Because I wasn't a military historian, I wasn't looking at it so much from the question of whether our troops would win or not win. But I started to basically more arrive at this is not the right war. And even to the point of view, this borderlines on not being a just war. Because when I went back to college in the fall of '66, I told my friends who had urged me to read up that, you know something, you were absolutely right. I've learned that this war is a highly questionable war, and that one that we really shouldn't be engaging in. It was on a day in April of 1967. The day was Holy Thursday. I was a practicing Catholic at the time. And I was at Mass on the Holy Thursday with my closest high school friend, Nick Reardon, and a neighbor of his who was studying for the priesthood. And we were surprised when the priest came out to the pulpit first, rather than just starting to say the Mass, but came to where he would present a sermon. And he did it because he said, "I'm so sorry to report, but Jimmy Bates has died in Vietnam today." He had been someone I had played sports with, against, because he was at the parochial high school. And that one hit. That one hit hard. Now I was really the first person that I knew that had died. That night, I was at my girlfriend's house when Nick called, and he said, "I hope you're seated." I said, "Why?" "John Pizzullo's gone." I said, "What?" On that same day, a second classmate had died in the war. And it hit me in a way that then I needed to do more. In other words, I knew this war was wrong. Now it had hit home. It shouldn't have taken that. It really shouldn't have, but in reality, it did. And so I returned to campus, found the anti-war organization that existed. What are we doing? We're petitioning against the bombing of North Vietnam. It wasn't even a full position against the war. It was a petition against the bombing of North Vietnam, of civilian targets, not unlike the issue that we're facing in Gaza today, of civilians being the victims of war. And I became an activist, and I have never looked back. So I became an activist here in Minnesota, first on the campus at the University of Minnesota, and then became one of the founders of an organization called the Minnesota Peace Action Coalition, which still exists, which galvanized community opposition to the war in Vietnam. And it was very well connected within Minnesota at that time. I had a chance to interact. He was then a private citizen, not in Congress, with the Johnny grad, Senator Eugene McCarthy, a vocal opponent of the war and someone who we worked with in that era, a very important moral voice against the war. And so I did that until the war eventually, came to its end of American soldiers there in 1973. In the immediate aftermath, actually, of the Vietnam War, I was very focused on Latin America and what was happening there, a particularly gruesome coup that occurred in Chile on 9/11, 1973, that we now know, even from documents revealed within the last year, that the United States government had involvement in this coup against the democratically elected government that happened to be socialist. And I became involved in the cause over the next 2 or 3 years of working on behalf of political prisoners that were in Chilean jails as the result of this situation. When I came to St. John's in fall of 1977, I was still working on some of those political prisoner issues and helped the formation of an Amnesty International chapter here at St. John's, St. Ben's. I think the main thing is learn first. In other words, if there's an issue that you potentially feel strong about, and right now, right, we're in the midst of the of a resurgence of fighting in the Middle East involving Israel and the Palestinians. I would urge people, and again, you need to do it quickly in some circumstances because the times may demand that you take action and have a point of view, but that doesn't mean that you don't study first. You learn the issues first. You go to scholarly works. It's one of the ways that I always tell my students in terms of whether a piece is, it's got to pass the muster of Google Scholar. It's got to be there. It's got to be a peer-reviewed piece of scholarship. And I say that more now than ever because of all the stuff that's out there and the different opinion pieces and everything. So the need to understand the issues surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli question over the past roughly 125 years, beginning at the end of the 19th century, to have an understanding of that history. And then if you have that, then you may be able to put in place exactly where your activism may fall.